I need you to hear one number. $100. That is what a barrel of oil costs right now, up from $70 before this war started. And that is just the beginning. Because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz today is not a story about ships and navies. It is a story about your gas bill, your grocery prices, and a mathematical trap that nobody in mainstream media is showing you. My name is on this channel, and today we go 3 layers deep into the crisis that could reshape the global economy for the rest of 2026. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been largely blocked by Iran since February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and killed its supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Since that day, the world's most important oil corridor has been choked, squeezed, and turned into a battlefield. Until that moment, the Strait of Hormuz was open, and about 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through it. That is 1 in 4 barrels of oil that the entire planet depends on. Gone. In retaliation, Iran launched missile and drone attacks on Israel, U.S. military bases, and U.S. allied Gulf states. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships, and reportedly laid sea mines in the strait. But here is what the TV news did not show you. Iran did not simply close the strait and walk away. The strait was not technically closed. Iran was gradually allowing some tankers through in exchange for a toll of up to $2 million per ship. And, crucially, Iran was allowing its own oil to pass in and out of the region throughout the war, managing to export an average of 1.85 million barrels of crude a day through March, about 100,000 barrels more than in the previous 3 months, according to data from Kepler. Let that sink in. While the world screamed about a blockade, Iran was quietly running a toll booth, charging $2 million per ship, collecting payments in Chinese yuan, and selling its own oil at record volumes. That is not a country being strangled by sanctions. That is a country that turned a choke point into a cash machine. Vice President J.D. Vance and other U.S. negotiators flew to Islamabad for weekend peace talks with Iran, raising hopes that a deal to end the war was at hand. But Vance said early Sunday that the U.S. delegation would return home without a deal. After 21 hours of negotiations, Iran still refused to agree not to seek or develop a nuclear weapon, Vance said. And then came the announcement. Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, Trump said in a post to his social media platform Truth Social. Sounds decisive. Sounds powerful. Now let me show you layer 1. The military reality that makes this blockade far more complicated than any headline suggests. Enforcing the blockade is likely to demand significant resources from the U.S. Navy and has prompted concerns about military force and international law, experts say. The biggest challenge is the enormous volume of shipping traffic that usually transits the Strait of Hormuz. A considerable number of ships may be needed to enforce the restrictions, said Siddharth Kaushal, a naval power expert at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Kaushal said, "A lot depends on the early days of the blockade, how many vessels the Americans can seize, how much they can convince vessels attempting to slip through a cordon that they're likely to be seized. But in all likelihood, I'd say it will prove difficult for the U.S. to enforce." And the very first day proved him right. 1 oil tanker passed through the Strait of Hormuz in the early hours of Tuesday. The Chinese-owned vessel Rich Starry, according to marine traffic data. Rich Starry is owned by Full Star Shipping Ltd., linked to Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Co. Ltd., and has been sanctioned by the United States since 2023 due to its Iran ties. Another sanctioned tanker, the Elpis, also passed through the strait overnight. 2 sanctioned tankers, through a blockade announced by the most powerful navy in the world. On day 1. This is not a failure of will. It is a failure of physics. The strait is narrow, yes, but the legal, logistical, and diplomatic complexity of stopping every ship is enormous. CENTCOM itself clarified that the blockade will be enforced on all ships entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas, but will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. So the blockade has a built-in loophole. Ships not going to Iranian ports can pass freely, which means Iran's shadow fleet just needs creative paperwork to keep moving. And then there is the mine problem. U.S. warships crossed the Strait of Hormuz on Saturday for the first time since the war began, in a mine-clearing mission that Iran reportedly called a ceasefire violation. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said military vessels approaching the strait will be considered a ceasefire violation, according to IRGC-linked Fars news agency. This means that the act of enforcing the blockade itself could restart a hot war. Every mine-clearing operation is a potential trigger. In a dramatic expansion of the conflict, a large explosion caused by a sea drone struck the oil tanker Sonangol Namibe, which was anchored near Mubarak al-Kabir port in Kuwait, more than 800 kilometers from the strait. The attack caused an oil spill that posed an environmental risk. 800 kilometers. IRGC drones can reach Kuwait. They can reach the UAE. They can reach any tanker in the Persian Gulf. The front line is not a line at all. It is an entire sea. Now layer 2. Follow the money, because this is where the real story lives. Traffic through the strait is well below pre-war levels, when more than 100 vessels made the trip daily. On most days since the war began, fewer than 10 ships a day have been able to pass through. That is a 90% collapse in transit. There are about 400 loaded oil tankers in the Gulf waiting to get out, and only about 100 empty tankers eager to get in. 400 tankers, loaded with oil, sitting, waiting, going nowhere. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed that 230 loaded oil tankers are waiting inside the Gulf. And who is profiting from this chaos? Iran, for one. Iran managed to export an average of 1.85 million barrels of crude a day through March, about 100,000 barrels more than in the previous 3 months. The toll revenue from friendly ships is collected in Chinese yuan, according to Lloyd's List. Not dollars, not subject to SWIFT, not traceable through Western banking systems. Chinese, Indian, and Pakistani ships have been among the few to transit the strait under deals with Tehran, meaning Trump's interdiction order could put the U.S. on a collision course with more countries depending on Iran for oil. This is where the blockade becomes a geopolitical grenade. Because to truly stop Iran's oil revenue, the U.S. would have to intercept Chinese ships. Chinese ships, the vessels of the world's second-largest economy and America's largest trading partner. Trump said that any country, potentially including China, that assists Iran will be slapped with a 50% tariff levied by the U.S. So we now have simultaneously a naval blockade, a potential military escalation with Iran, and a trade war threat against China. 3 crises, layered on top of each other, all in the same week. Now let us talk about what the market said. Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, rose 7% to $102 a barrel, a gain of 40% since the start of the war. WTI, the U.S. benchmark, climbed by 7.8% to $104 a barrel, more than 50% higher than before the war effectively shuttered the Strait of Hormuz. 50%. Your gasoline does not just follow the barrel price. It tracks it with a slight delay. Which brings us to layer 3. This is the part that affects you directly, wherever you are watching this video from. Already, unleaded gas prices have risen more than $1.20 per gallon since the war began, to a national average of $4.12 on Monday, according to WLDA. American drivers have seen gas prices spike to an average of more than $4.12 a gallon, up from $2.98 before the war. That is a 38% increase. On your commute, on your grocery delivery, on every product that moves by truck, plane, or ship. Because oil is not just fuel. Oil is the invisible tax inside every single thing you buy. The blockade is also hurting the transportation of food and fertilizer, said Patrick Penfield, professor of supply chain practice at Syracuse University. He said the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and others could especially see dramatic food price increases as supplies will have to be flown in. Some 30% of the world's fertilizer comes through the strait, potentially harming farmers and worsening hunger worldwide. Now you're talking about impacting the global harvest, Penfield said. 30% of the world's fertilizer. This is not a Middle East problem. This is a wheat problem, a corn problem, a bread problem. Every farmer in the world who depends on fertilizer is now pricing in this crisis, and that price will reach your plate by summer. Karen Young, a senior scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, told CNN that the blockade means the problem of a shortage of about 7 million barrels of crude and 4 million barrels of product per day just got worse. She warned that it could be a long time before oil prices go down, even after the war ends, noting that prices won't decline until the strait is reopened and damaged oil facilities are repaired. She added, "So I think for now, and into the end of 2026, we're looking at elevated oil prices for certain." And here is the detail that Wall Street is quietly panicking about. Even if the vital waterway fully opens and oil and other necessary cargo sail out, it won't be enough to return things to normal. That's because empty ships will need to sail back into the strait to keep the flow of goods moving. Experts say that shipping lines won't start entering the Persian Gulf through the strait, as long as there's a strong risk that the ceasefire is only temporary. Smith said if the strait were to open today, it would still likely take until July for oil flows to get back to normal. July, at the earliest. And that is the optimistic scenario. In a world where the blockade is now in place, where allies are refusing to join, and where Iran is still charging tolls, July sounds like a fantasy. Speaking of allies, let us talk about the Atlantic Alliance for a moment, because this crisis is exposing cracks that NATO has tried to paper over for years. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Monday that the United Kingdom will not join President Trump's blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. Starmer said his focus was to keep the waterway open. French President Emmanuel Macron said France and Britain would co-organize a conference of countries prepared to contribute to a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. America blockades. Britain and France organize a counter-mission to reopen what America just blocked. These are supposed to be the same alliance. Earlier in the war, to Trump's chagrin, NATO allies rebuffed the U.S. president's call for them to provide military support to secure the strait. The Western world is splitting along this choke point, 54 kilometers wide. And now, the final twist. The one that makes this entire story feel like a poker game rather than a war. Trump told reporters at the White House on Monday afternoon they'd like to make a deal very badly. The president said Iran had called the U.S. that morning. The two sides are still communicating, a U.S. official told CNN, after peace talks in Pakistan failed. U.S. officials are discussing details for a potential second in-person meeting with the Iranians. So let me paint you the full picture. The U.S. announces a blockade. Iran's sanctioned ships sail through it anyway. Oil jumps to $102 a barrel. Gas in America hits $4.12 a gallon. Britain and France refuse to join. And then, Iran calls Washington, and Washington picks up. Vice President J.D. Vance, after returning from unsuccessful negotiations, said that it is up to Iran to make the next move on peace talks. Whether we have further conversations, whether we ultimately get to a deal, I really think the ball is in the Iranian court, because we put a lot on the table, Vance said. Washington and Tehran could not reach final agreements, Vance said, on Trump's two non-negotiables, removing Iran's enriched uranium from the country and implementing verification measures to ensure that they cannot obtain nuclear weapons. These are the two walls that crashed the talks. And here is my honest analysis, the one you won't hear on cable news. The gap between these positions is not just technical, it is existential. Iran without the ability to enrich uranium is a different Iran, a weaker Iran, an Iran that cannot deter future attacks. Tehran knows this, and so they are playing the oldest game in geopolitics. Make time your ally. Iran's foreign minister described the Islamabad negotiations as the most intensive engagement between the two countries in 47 years. 47 years of near silence, then 21 hours of talking, and then a blockade. Iran's foreign minister Araghchi said that when the sides were just inches away from an agreement, they encountered maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. Whether you believe Tehran or Washington on that point depends on your perspective. But here is what is mathematically certain. Every week this stalemate continues. Iran collects toll money. The shadow fleet moves oil to China. Global prices stay elevated. And ordinary people, in Detroit, in Berlin, in Jakarta, in São Paulo, pay more for everything. As Vidyamani, a visiting associate professor at Cornell University whose research focuses on supply chains, put it, the problem with a two-sided blockade is that you know it's going to take much longer for the strait to open up and for some kind of agreement to come about. And that's what's going to send these prices further skyrocketing. This is the mathematical inevitability that nobody in the mainstream media is spelling out for you. Two blockades in the same strait. One from Iran, one from the US. Neither side can afford to blink completely. Neither side can afford to fully escalate. And in the middle of that frozen standoff, the global economy bleeds out, barrel by barrel, dollar by dollar, loaf of bread by loaf of bread. The historical parallel I keep coming back to is the oil embargo of 1973. When Arab nations cut off oil to the West, prices quadrupled in months. Governments introduced rationing. In the Netherlands, they banned Sunday driving. In the US, people waited in gas lines for hours. And that was a partial embargo by a coalition of countries, not a full closure of the world's single most important oil choke point. What we are living through right now is structurally worse. And yet the markets are still pricing in a quick resolution. That optimism, in my view, is the most dangerous thing happening in global finance right now. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I genuinely want to read your answer in the comments. We know Trump is applying maximum pressure with a blockade. We know Iran is still selling oil, still collecting tolls, still running the clock. We know allies are refusing to join, and we know talks could resume at any moment. But ask yourself this. If Iran is the side that called Washington first on Monday morning, and if their sanctioned ships are still passing through the blockade on day one, who exactly is winning this game of chicken? Is the blockade a weapon that will force Iran to the table? Or is it a gift that gives Tehran the moral high ground, the sympathy of China and Europe, and a perfect excuse to delay any deal until 2027? Because if the answer is the second option, then everything you have been told about who has leverage in this crisis is completely wrong. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video gave you something the evening news did not, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.